fascinated with the conference comparisons, as apparently others are as well. I released a top 25 debate. I'll call it a debate with Will Gunter, our South Carolina guy, yesterday, and it's already got 44 comments. So people get their dander up a bit when it comes to discussing conferences and who is the best conference. So my thoughts are that I don't know if it's my bent to be a contrarian to a certain extent, or I just try to look and dig a little bit deeper than the national narrative, which typically hangs on one or two games. So it was up in the air a decade ago as to the best conference, and then Florida put the throttle down on Ohio State in the BCS championship game when the Buckeyes were the consensus number one, and everyone thought this team was an all-time great team, and they got completely taken apart by Florida. Then Ohio State comes back the next year and loses, and the Big Ten is considered down, which it was. But if the narrative always becomes overblown. So the group thing takes over, and a couple games dictate what everyone thinks. And so I was arguing for the past decade that while the SEC was clearly the best conference, that it was much closer than the national narrative and perspective of most fans. Because if you dug a little bit deeper, you saw that games were close in a lot of instances, and that's what I'm looking at, is the performance on the field when you're comparing the conferences. Obviously, the results are all that matters, but there's a difference in evaluating two teams when the score's 30-27 than when it's 52-3. And now here, it seems as though the SEC has gotten knocked down a few pegs, and rightfully so. But I would be very confident in the SEC playing 14 against 14 or 12 or 10, depending on the conference. And if it was feasible, if every team in the SEC could play every team in every other conference, I have no doubt that the SEC would win more than 50% of those games against the other conferences, because it's the deepest quality conference. I think the Pac-12 is deep, but the Alabama factor, and this is another conversation I get into with people, and the first thing out of their mouth is, well, take Alabama out of the SEC. Well, that kind of doesn't work, because Alabama is a member of the SEC, just like Ohio State and Clemson are members of their conference, and the quality of that conference would be knocked down considerably. Yes, there's a bigger gap that's been established in the last 3 to 4 football seasons with Alabama and everyone else, but LSU, Auburn, Georgia, Tennessee, I see quality there. I don't see top 5 teams like we saw the SEC littering the top 5 and the top 10 over the past 10 years, but I see top 12 to 15 programs. So I think the SEC top to bottom is much stronger than the other conferences. Maybe the top half isn't as strong as possibly the ACC and the Big Ten may have the top 4 or 5 slots that they can boast about over the SEC. But top to bottom, I still take the SEC.
Yeah, Mark, it's interesting. At the conclusion of last season, again on Last Word on collegefootball.com, I did a conference breakdown. You can go there, search my name, or search articles, or just search conference call. And what I did was I broke down the conferences. I used the same measurement, or the same metric, to measure every team and their strength, their game, their win, their game, their winning game strength. So if a team had 4 out of conference games, I evaluated all 4 of those games and gave each team a score for how well they did on their out of conference performance for the season. It's interesting because I broke it down into quarters. I think you're correct. I think where the SEC's strength lies in its depth, and the only conference that had a positive score for every quarter, so the top fourth of the conference, the upper middle fourth of the conference, the lower middle fourth of the conference, and the bottom fourth of the conference, was the SEC. They were the only conference that had a positive score in each of those 4 quartiles. So that just kind of goes back to and reinforces your point, which I think I agree with, is that the SEC from top to bottom, their strength lies in the strength of the conference top to bottom. Not just, if you look at the Big Ten, their strength is the top quarter. Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, Wisconsin. That's probably when you look at the top quarter of a conference, that's probably the best conference from 2016, no doubt. But when you get down to the bottom, see the Big Ten had a 2.13 in the bottom quarter for me, and then a minus 11 for the lower middle fourth of the conference. So that's teams 8, 9, and 10. They did not do well compared to all the other conferences schools who were in the 8th, 9th, and 10th position. The SEC, by comparison, had 11.9 on those 8, 9, and 10 teams. And then their 11, 12, 13, and 14 teams had a 2.42, Big Ten coming in at 2.13. So that's just kind of how, I used a metric system to measure that, determined it before the season, didn't apply any factors that might benefit anybody who I might be predisposed to benefit. And then when I looked at it, it was clear to me that the strength of the SEC was the depth. The conference that actually came out on top for my rankings last year was the ACC. Let me make sure. Yes, it was the ACC. And then the SEC was second, followed by the the Big Ten. So that's kind of how it worked out for me. But again, the SEC strength was the depth 1 through 14, just like you were talking about.
Yeah, the focus is on the top part of the league. Missouri could be considered awful to a certain extent within the conference, but if you compare them to other conferences, assuming that the Tigers are the worst team in the SEC, look at last year. Ole Miss was the only other team that missed postseason play. Purdue, Rutgers, and Illinois are awful football teams. Ole Miss is loaded with talent. Yes, they may go 5-7 again. I think they're out of conference schedule is going to prop them up a little bit. They don't have any huge games out of conference, but the bottom teams in the SEC are not awful football teams like we see in other conferences, i.e., again, what I just stated in the Big Ten, Kansas, Iowa State, the Pac-12. See, I sometimes stand up for the Pac-12, which has really taken a tumble in the national perspective, challenged the SEC as the best conference in college football, I believe, in 2014, had a 13-6 postseason record, and or 13-6 overall non-conference Power 5 record, and played extremely well in the big games, made it to the national championship game. Oregon State was the awful program in the Pac-12, but it's certainly not it's certainly done a nice job under Gary Anderson of becoming respectable in the last few years. And the Pac-12 is awfully deep, but it's not quality deep. There are a lot of decent teams in the Pac-12. Somebody needs to step up, like you mentioned a few minutes ago, whether that be Oregon or someone else, to join USC and Washington.
Yeah, I agree. Utah's a team that could really help out the Pac-12 if they've looked good at the start of the season, the past 2 seasons. If they could finish strong, that would really help the conference. Colorado helped the conference last year, but Pac-12 kind of started on the wrong foot last year. UCLA losing to Texas A&M week 1, and then USC just getting drubbed by Alabama. So they got off to a bad start from week 1, and then what's hurt them with the metrics the last couple of years is they had these unexplainable FCS losses. Washington State, a good team, losing to an FCS team, I believe, 2015 season to start that off. So those FCS losses, when you get into the kind of the metrics and the computers, those FCS losses really kill a conference's power rankings.